Hello and welcome back to another We Ourselves video. And today I want to talk about Jonathan Majors' Kang. After seeing the Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, I felt that Jonathan Majors' Kang the Conqueror, like other black characters in the MCU, was underutilized, particularly when you compare him to Eric Killmonger and the High Evolutionary, both portrayed by black actors. Now, originally I wanted to do this video right after viewing Ant-Man 3, but I held off and I'm glad I did. With Jonathan Majors' upcoming trial and the current frenzy of conflicting news stories and speculations on whether Marvel will drop him in favor of Dr. Doom, it felt like the right time to finally give my opinion on Kang. Because whether or not Marvel keeps him around, I feel the studio has already subverted Kang's effectiveness as the next big villain. In the past few weeks, we've seen conflicting media stories about Marvel's decision to either move away from Kang and use Dr. Doom as the next big baddie, or suddenly the exact opposite, that Marvel's gonna stick with Jonathan Majors' Kang. Obviously, it seems to me that at this time, Marvel's gonna wait and see the outcome of the trial. Even though I said that it feels like they've already made the decision to move away, and I think they probably have, but they haven't officially made the announcement. And so I think they'll wait until after the trial. Whether Jonathan Majors is found innocent or not, I think Marvel has already subverted and done irreparable harm to his character of Kang the Conqueror. Spoiler alert, I will be talking about both Season 1, Season 2, and Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. So, spoiler alert, you've been warned. We were first introduced to Kang in Loki Season 1. We were actually introduced to the TVA first, and then in the 6th and final episode of the series, we were able to finally meet a version of Kang, He Who Remains, who managed to set up the sacred timeline by defeating all the other Kangs. And the TVA was set up to make sure that none of his variants were able to reappear and ignite a multiversal war again. But I felt Marvel started to subvert his effectiveness as a big villain. And one of the ways in which they did that, particularly in the first season, I think, was the technological aspect. He Who Remains tells Sylvie and Loki that he was a scientist, a brilliant scientist who lived in the 31st century. Now, in the comic books, that was the way it was. Kang was a brilliant scientist from the 31st century, but one of the hallmarks of his ability and his power was his advanced knowledge and technology allowed him to fight and defeat heroes and other people in the comic books. And with that advanced technology and knowledge, he was able to traverse time. But when it comes to Loki Season 1, even though Kang says he's from the 31st century in the 6th episode, when we see the technology in the TVA, it does not look like 31st century technology. Of course, they have the TEM pads and they can open doorways and they can go into different branches and then go into the timeline. But the technology itself does not look like 31st century. And I honestly never understood why they made that artistic decision, considering that the thing that allowed Kang to be as unstoppable as he was the fact that he had this advanced technology from the 31st century. Now, of course, we have Stark Tech and things like that, which also kind of looks very, very futuristic, but still that was one of the hallmarks of Kang in the comics. And although they paid lip service to it here, already I think that Marvel was undermining that by having Kang and the TVA look like they were set in the 1950s or 60s. Now, I know the artistic look and design of the show and the interiors of the TVA were really designed to look like they talked about a mid-century modern design, or as the set designer said, a mad-century modernism. And the people who designed it talked about a brutalism, and they were going for that DMV type of look, or as they said, the Soviet-era control rooms, or New Deal architecture, a big American oil company headquarters, or even the TWA terminal. That was the look that they were going for. And while they're patting themselves on the back for having successfully produced that, none of it, in my opinion, looks like 31st century technology. Yes, you have that moment when Loki arrives and he looks outside the window and he sees all the buildings and the flying cars and he thinks it's magic. That looks like it might be 31st century technology, but that was it for Loki. Everything else was really settled in technology that looked very old. One of the other things that I found that undermined Kang as an effective villain was the fact that they gave him no flashbacks to his life on his original timeline. Yes, he gave a really nice presentation with the little 3D people talking about how he discovered that there were multiple parallel universes and how he managed to contact them and the other Kangs were doing the same thing, kind of inferring that they were in the 31st century. Whether or not they were all as advanced technologically or not, that remains to be seen, but he did say they exchanged technology and things like that. But we never really see his background because each one of these Kangs that he is playing, they are variants, but they have their own story. We've been introduced to 3 Kangs by now, variants, but none of them have really had their time to shine in terms of who they were as a character. We get the most explanation of why He Who Remains is doing what he's doing, but we really never get to go back and really see him on the timeline. There's no flashbacks. You know, it's one of my pet peeves in this channel that Marvel really has a blind spot or a handicap when it comes to doing justice to its black characters. What was introduced here was the idea that we were going to see multiple versions of this character die or be defeated, which normally meant dying, before we got up to the Avengers Kang Dynasty. And so to me, that was not something that I really looked forward to because I can't imagine that there have been any other movie villains that were going to die in different versions of them, die as many times as what they looked like they were going to do with the MCU. But anyway, those are the 2 reasons that I thought that Loki Season 2 really started to undermine Kang as an effective villain. They weren't doing justice to his story. Even though Jonathan Major was bringing his A game and those conversations were probably the best things in that first season, he still didn't get the proper treatment. And then that brings us to Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and we get Kang the Conqueror. Now, I will say that his time chair and Chronopolis and the technology, I can believe that that's 31st century technology. Problem is, you have 3 regular women, basically, and ants defeat this man with his 31st century technology, and it brought up the problem that a lot of people pointed out when they understood that you were going to have multiple Kangs probably get defeated leading up to Kang Dynasty. How are you going to have that many versions of him defeated, including Kang the Conqueror himself, and yet still be a credible villain to the Avengers in their next movie? What was the plan? To use one of the Kangs that were introduced to us at the end of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania? We don't know who they are. We got to know He Who Remains. We kind of sort of got to know Kang the Conqueror. And shout out to all the comic book nerds out there who are doing their channels. If not for them, we wouldn't know half the things we know about Kang. For those who aren't real comic book nerds or who did not know the story, thank God we have them because Marvel isn't giving you jack on these people. And that's part of my problem. You can't really build them up to a credible villain if we really don't know where they're coming from and what makes them tick. Not building up sympathy, but giving us the villain's motive and what they're doing. We got a motive for He Who Remains, but still, you could have done more. And I point to Eric Killmonger and the High Evolutionary. Black Panther won because they expected to fail, so they weren't really having a lot of mandates on them in terms of the story, so they were able to give Killmonger some background, and it made him one of the most nuanced villains that Marvel had to that time. And then we had Thanos. But when it came to High Evolutionary, thank you James Gunn, who was already out of there, so there was nothing they were going to say to him. He always focuses on character, so when the High Evolutionary was cast as a black man, that didn't suddenly put on the brakes to Gunn doing good characterization for this actor, unlike the regular Marvel machine. I don't know what the algorithm is, but when it comes to a black character, it's like there's a different subroutine that takes them away from doing characterization for black characters, men and women. Other characters, minority characters, they get characterizations, they get flashbacks. But when it comes to black characters, I don't know what it is about Marvel, but it's like there's a switch that gets turned off. James Gunn always does characterization. He did his thing. He was out the door anyway. He's now headed their rival company. So the High Evolutionary got beautiful characterization. Kang, who's going to be your next big villain, bigger than Killmonger and the High Evolutionary, and you don't give him equal characterization. And in Ant-Man and the Wasp, it really should have been his story. We got enough about He Who Remains and his rationale. We needed to see Kang the Conqueror story. The movie should have been about him. The same way that we were introduced to the High Evolutionary and saw him die in one movie, the same way we were introduced to Killmonger and saw him die in one movie, it should have been the same thing with Kang the Conqueror. The movie flopped, and so here we have Marvel once again failing to really build up their main big bad guy who was going to be in the next Avengers movie, Kang Dynasty. And then you have Loki season 2, which I feel went even further in undermining He Who Remains, or Kang, by suggesting that the technology that he uses may have come from somebody else's mind. But that's going to be in part 2 of this video, and I'll end it right here. And as always, thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.